Koinach, good day, fellow South Africans and citizens of the world.
I've been looking around for salvation. I've been looking around for the truth. All around me I see frustration, and I looked all over till I found you. I sit and listen to your stories, and you're telling me, please don't worry. There's a lot in this world you should know, and love in life is where you should go. If you're looking for somewhere to go, if you're looking for someone to know, if you're looking for someone to guide you, then love in life will guide you.
Koinant, good evening, fellow South Africans and citizens of the world, and welcome to tonight's live stream. Before introducing David Coltart, it gives me great pleasure to make an announcement to the Loving Life family. In the tradition of this channel, I make surprise announcements involving members of our Loving Life community. Tonight, it gives me great pleasure to announce Rudy Geldenhuys as our Loving Life channel hero. Rudy is downloading nearly 6,000 videos from the Loving Life channels onto YouTube, from YouTube, and putting them all onto a completely secure and separate server so that the valuable footage is protected from the fast fingers of YouTube moderators who are currently deleting channels which do not fit with Google's political views. Once the news channel has been completed, I will be promoting it regularly while continuing to place videos on YouTube as before. Marlena de Villiers is on her way by plane to Cape Town to see her ailing mother. She will not be able to join the live stream for about a week until her return. Please keep her mother in your prayers. Now, tonight we meet a man who is often interviewed on the BBC. David Coltart is a prominent Zimbabwean living in a country racked with starvation and the abuse of human rights. Could this be where South Africa is headed under the ANC government? A very poignant and relevant question. Please remember to subscribe to the Loving Life channel to be kept informed, and put any questions you have for David in the side chat. Now, let's cross to David Coltart.
Good evening, Scott.
Hi David, how are you?
I'm well, thank you. Good to be with you.
Great to have you with us, David. Now, really the question I want to ask you to start off with is, what keeps you and your family in Zimbabwe?
A variety of things. First of all, our faith. That is, my wife and I were both at UCT. Our families had left Zimbabwe, and we felt called back to Zimbabwe way back in 1983, and we don't believe that call has changed in any way. So that is our fundamental reason. But secondly, we are both born Zimbabweans. We're citizens. We love this country with a passion. We believe in it. We believe in its people. We believe in its potential. And despite the chaos which prevails in our nation, we still believe that this is a country with enormous potential and that it can come right. Then thirdly, we obviously have our home here. We have many friends. Our family is entirely here. We have 4 children here. They all work in Zimbabwe. And we have an entire community. And, finally, for all the bad press on Zimbabwe, despite all that ZANU-PF has done to destroy it, is still a magnificent country to live in. We have low crime rates. There is hardly any racism in this country. As a white Zimbabwean, I do not feel the anger that perhaps whites in other countries might experience. So those are the reasons, and we are committed to being here and seeing the dawn of a new day where democracy and freedom and tolerance prevail in this nation.
Right. Now, it's interesting you mentioned that final point about crime and racism, because to the south in South Africa, clearly there is such a lot of division being created by certain political parties in South Africa. And also the crime rate in South Africa is absolutely horrific. Why do you think it's so different in that country compared to Zimbabwe? Is it the people? What is it that makes it so different?
I think it's down to a variety of factors. Firstly, although we had our version of apartheid in Rhodesia, it wasn't as clinically implemented as it was in South Africa. Although we had a civil war, the government was not as harsh, I think, on the black majority as was the case in South Africa. I think a second reason comes down to education. Zimbabweans, for decades, going right the way back to the 50s, all Zimbabweans have had access to an excellent education system. Prior to independence, obviously, there was a very narrow channel in which black Zimbabweans had to go through to get a good education. But if they were bright enough or had sufficient funding, they could get a superb education. And I think that that's given black Zimbabweans a completely different perspective than perhaps many, for example, black South Africans. And I think finally, and this is somewhat of an irony, is that because of the economic chaos in this country in the last 30 to 40 years, we have exported some of our crime. That sounds odd, but sadly, many of the criminals in South Africa are Zimbabweans. Not a majority, but there are a substantial number of Zimbabwean criminals in South Africa. And South Africa, relative to Zimbabwe, is a very wealthy country. There are a lot more luxury vehicles in South Africa to hijack than there are in Zimbabwe. And quite frankly, there's a lot more loot down there than here. And I think that all of that accounts for it. But one final point. People sometimes get frustrated with black Zimbabweans and say, well, why haven't you overthrown in the past Mugabe and now Mnangagwa? And there is something about the character, and it's one of the characteristics of my black fellow Zimbabweans in this country. I think having been through a war, through a dreadful civil war, most black Zimbabweans try to avoid violence as best they can. And of course, that means that we have far less violent crime than is the case in South Africa.
Right. Now, I have to tell you a little story. When I was just 18 years old, it was back in 1973, the first holiday I took was to the old Rhodesia. And I arrived in Salisbury on a Saturday night in one of these little tours. You went from Salisbury to Kariba Dam, then to Victoria Falls and all this sort of stuff. But the first night I will never forget. I was in Salisbury. It was about 7 o'clock at night or 8 o'clock at night. I'd just had dinner. I went to the concierge at the Monopatapa Hotel. And I said, look, I'm an 18-year-old fellow. I'd love to go to a club. Are there any clubs around here? And he said, yeah, there's one just around the corner. He said, you go over there, there, and down the stairs, and bang, bingo, you're there. So I did this, and I walked into this club, and there were about 130 people in the club. Do you know what? I was the only male. All the young guys were fighting on the border, and when I walked into that club, I was mobbed. I mean, the ladies could not believe that there was actually a young fellow around. Oh, what a night that was. Absolutely fantastic. I will never forget that night. Now, I digress. One of the interesting things about that war, that savage war that Zimbabwe went through, because it was really on the front line of the action, whereas South Africa basically had Zim like a bit of a buffer. The real thing that really sticks out is the number of Africans who actually made up the Zimbabwean forces. You know, they wanted to protect the country as it was too.
That was one of the curious features of the war, that a lot of black Zimbabweans, then black Rhodesians, were in the police and the army.
Yeah.
I was in the police. I had to do my time as a white youngster straight after school, and I recall my first patrols as a policeman along the banks of the Shashi River adjoining Botswana, and my entire stick was made up of black colleagues. I was the only white.
Yeah.
And they were absolutely committed and reliable comrades in arms. So yes, it was a strange phenomenon.
And then it all changed in 1980. That's when Mugabe got in, and things started going really pear-shaped.
Well, my own view is that it actually went pear-shaped earlier than that. If one goes back into the history of Rhodesia and then Zimbabwe, if you look at what happened in the 1950s, Southern Rhodesia was on a very positive trajectory.
Right.
Coming back to education, the government then was expanding education, and although the government did not advocate for, majority rule, that there was a clear path towards majority rule that was going to happen through evolution rather than revolution. And there was a broad consensus in the country. And unfortunately, what happened in the 1960s was that there was a polarization which took place, and both white nationalists and black nationalists went to the two extremes, and it resulted in this war. So in my view, that's when things started to go pear-shaped. And we've never really recovered from that. The bitterness that war evoked is still felt today. I often argue that one of the reasons why Zimbabwe is still in so much difficulty today is because a national calamity of post-traumatic stress syndrome. You've got people 40 years after that war who are still fighting the war on both sides.
Yeah.
And that leads to this insanity. So unfortunately, although Rhodesia was very well run in the 1960s and 1970s, a lot of bitterness and poison was injected into our body politic at that time. And so when independence came in 1980, we had many unresolved problems. And unfortunately, that situation was compounded by the desire of the international community to rid themselves of this Rhodesian problem. And in many ways, the Lancaster House settlement was an expedient deal. For example, there was never a Truth and Reconciliation Commission. And so all the atrocities that were committed, and let me say this, by both sides during the war, were never accounted for. So Mugabe came in with this clean slate, and the world looked the other way. He was the darling, and Britain in particular wanted to be expedient. And as we know, history shows, within a few years of coming to power, Mugabe turned on Joshua Nkomo, his former colleague, and wrought on this country a genocide, which started in 1982 and went right the way through to 1987. But the point I'm making is that for people who studied the country closely in 1980, for all the euphoria that was experienced then, the fact is that the foundations were always very shaky.
Right. Now, I understand that Henry Kissinger actually flew into what was in Salisbury to meet with Ian Smith. And it was after that meeting that basically the country was handed over, or that's when things changed. Have you heard about that meeting?
Well, Kissinger never came to Rhodesia. He met Smith in Pretoria at the behest of Forster in 1976.
Right.
And the combination of Kissinger and Forster managed to extract a concession from Smith that he would concede to the principle of majority rule. Now, that was 1976. The country took another 4 years, a very bloody 4 years, to come to the Lancaster House Agreement. But yes, it was that visit by Kissinger to Southern Africa that led to that concession. And Smith did try and implement. But he did it in sort of half-hearted measures. He met with Muzarewa and Sotoli. He even met with Nkomo. But quite frankly, I think by that time it was too late, because the ZANLA and ZIPRA forces were already well entrenched in the country. Yeah. And Mugabe in particular was in no mind to compromise. He wanted total power and nothing less.
Well, if Ian Smith felt betrayed by Forster, I could absolutely understand why. I mean, I think that South Africa should have stood by the country. But anyway, that's history now. So let's move forward to the Mugabe regime. I mean, he basically just plundered the country, didn't he, over his 25-year or whatever it was reign or autocracy.
Mugabe was in power for 37 years. And,
37, wow.
37 years. Just to remind you, President Nyerere of Tanzania said to Mugabe in a very well-publicized statement at the time that he was taking over the jewel of Africa and he shouldn't ruin it. And the reality, sadly, is that Mugabe took over a country with a currency that was stronger than the US dollars.
It was stronger than the rand.
Stronger than the rand. Oh, way stronger than the rand. It was the second biggest economy in Southern Africa, one of the strongest economies in the whole of Africa, with a broad manufacturing base, a very strong agriculture sector, which had survived the ravages of war. And he also had the goodwill of countries like Britain and America and Europe, all the countries that his party is still at war with now. So he really had things on a platter. Yeah. The community was prepared to come to the party. You had people like David Smith and Dennis Norman, who came into his first cabinet. But he was so focused, and his party, people like Emerson Mnangagwa with him, was so focused on creating a one-party state, and then subsequent to that on the accumulation of wealth, that they destroyed that goodwill and they destroyed that economic base. And they've now, Mugabe in his 37 years, transformed Mugabe from this jewel into one of the poorest countries in the world.
Yeah. You know what's a bit alarming is that you can actually see the same thing happening in South Africa. You know, the same route being taken by the ANC government.
Well, there are fundamental differences between ZANU-PF and the ANC, and there's no doubt that the ANC under Zuma was headed down precisely the same road as ZANU-PF. I'm not saying that President Ramaphosa can change things or turn things around, but I do believe that Ramaphosa and Mandela are not in the same mold as Mugabe and Mnangagwa. This letter that Ramaphosa has issued recently on corruption,
yes,
which has resulted in this long, rambling response from Zuma,
yeah,
is an indication that he is at least trying to do the right thing. The question, of course, is whether he can pull it off, because obviously there are divisions within the ANC, and the big question is whether he can defeat this extremely corrupt element within the ANC, and it's an open question.
Yeah. Well, I find it very disturbing that you got people like Ace Magashula and David Mabuza holding such high positions in the ANC when you consider their history. It's absolutely disgusting, quite honestly. Okay, so we've covered Mugabe's reign briefly, and of course he was ousted by Emmerson Mnangagwa a couple of years ago. And things then went further south after Mnangagwa made certain promises about how he was going to turn the country around. How would you compare Mugabe's reign to Emerson's reign? What differentiates them?
Well, let me say this at the outset, that Mnangagwa, in my view, is far worse than Mugabe. For all Mugabe's faults, and let me put this right out there at the beginning, Mugabe and I did not see eye to eye on most issues. So I'm no apologist for Mugabe, but Mugabe himself was not corrupt. His wife was corrupt, but he himself was not corrupt. And Mugabe also had his limits. Even if we, for example, look at what happened in Matabeleland in the 1980s, whilst it's very clear that Mugabe was the person who must have ordered and authorized the crimes against humanity which took place. Right. They were carried out by Mnangagwa. And there were certainly occasions when, Mugabe clearly didn't know what was going on the ground, whereas Mnangagwa clearly did know what was going on the ground. But forget about that speculation. Let's just compare the two. Mnangagwa has done more in 2 years to erode human rights and to undermine the economy. There's been greater incidents of corruption in the last 2 years than there were in the 37 years of Mugabe's rule. And so by every indicator, Mnangagwa is a far worse leader than Mugabe. I got to know Mugabe well. I was Minister of Education in the inclusive government between 2009 and 2013. And I did see a different side to him. And it was always incongruous to me how this old man who had quite a good sense of humor and could be utterly charming could be responsible for these dreadful crimes against humanity. And now I understand it a lot better, because Mugabe always had a bit of finesse. He was a very intelligent man. He had 7 degrees. And there was an obvious intellect. And I think that probably acted as a restraint on brutality.
Right.
Whereas Mr. Mnangagwa does not have the intellect of Mr. Mugabe. And we are now seeing that he uses blunt instruments to achieve his political goals. I could go on all evening. I'm not going to bore you and your viewers about this, but let me just reiterate that Mr. Mnangagwa in 2 years has done more damage to this country than Mugabe's 37 years of rule.
Right. Now, don't you think one of the, it's the elephant in the room, really, is that if you consider, like in South Africa, pre-1994, you had politicians who were career politicians who had spent their lives building up to their position. They knew what they were doing. They were capable. They were competent, even if apartheid was abhorrent. But post-1994 or post-1980, if we look at Zimbabwe, what you actually had coming into power was a group of people who the day before had been terrorists, basically, and now they were put in this position where they were running the country. And there's no way it's rather like a policeman becoming a qualified doctor overnight. You can't do it. It can't work. And I think this is where things have gone so terribly wrong in southern Africa. And I'm talking about Zimbabwe, Mozambique, Angola, and of course Zimbabwe. What are your thoughts on that?
Let me go back to what I said earlier on in this about the history of this country in the last 60 years.
Right.
And particularly to go back to what was happening in this country in the 1950s. And let's talk about the economy for a start, just so that I can illustrate the point I was making. The 1950s in this country was the time of the greatest international investment. For example, during that time, Kariba Dam was built. It was conceived and built. Major infrastructural projects were developed. As Minister of Education, I know that some of our best private schools in the country, those who come from Zimbabwe will know that schools like Arundel and Falcon and Peterhouse, outstanding first world quality schools, were all developed in the 1950s. But at the same time, we had a government under particularly Garfield Todd, who was vilified by many white Rhodesians at the time, and quite frankly was no liberal. He did not believe in majority rule overnight. He believed, as I said earlier, in an evolutionary process, not a revolutionary process.
Right.
He felt that votes needed to be tied to education, but he was prepared to invest in black education so that over time, over decades, that's what he had in mind, black people would gradually become more educated, become experienced. He tried to draw black people into government so that they could become experienced civil servants and leaders. But unfortunately, he was a visionary way ahead of his time. And as I say, there was this polarization. White people were not prepared to consider the prospect of majority rule ever. Ian Smith said, never in 1,000 years.
Yeah.
And on the other extreme, black nationalists were not prepared to have an evolutionary process. They were not prepared to wait a couple of decades, wait for this training to take place. And they wanted majority rule immediately. And so we see how these two polarized positions created what Afrikaners would call a gemors.
A mess.
A total mess, because people took over when they did not have the experience.
Right.
And so it's wrong for us to blame either one of the extremes, because both were, quite frankly, complicit in this. And look, this is, it's history. It's water under the bridge.
Yeah.
We can't change things. But there's no doubt that had the vision of someone like Garfield Todd been captured and adopted, not just by white people, not just by the white electorate, it also needed black nationalists to understand this need, that you can't take over a sophisticated economy overnight and run it without the necessary expertise. But people didn't capture that vision, and that is why we have had this catastrophe. So, we've got to learn from it. And let me say this as well, and I'm not blaming whites who've left the country, because in 1980, many white civil servants lost their jobs. They were not able to stay in the civil service, and they saw that there would be no career path for them. But that exacerbated the situation. It compounded it even further. And so you had this exodus of highly skilled, particularly civil servants, from Rhodesia. And so there was not a transfer of skills, and it has resulted in a lot of chaos.
Right. Now, I just want to address the people watching the live stream at the moment. We've got well over 300 people watching right now. Please remember to subscribe to the Loving Life channel to be kept informed. And if you want to put questions to David, please feel free to in the side chat. Just put them in there, and I'll ask the moderators to capture those questions, and we'll put them to David later. Now, I went to a private school in South Africa. I went to Michael House. What happened to the private schools in Zimbabwe? Are any of them still functioning?
Scott, I'm relieved to be able to tell you that they are, remarkably. I mean, they have survived.
That's incredible.
So, and in fact, since independence, there have been a lot more private schools that were built. I started a school, for example, in Bulawayo in 1986 with friends called Petra, which in the last 3 decades has developed into one of the best private schools in the country. So you don't just have the old schools from the 50s, as I said earlier, the Arundels, the Peterhouses, the Falcons, but you have new private schools. They have had a bit of a roller coaster. When I took over as minister in 2009, the education system was on its knees, and of course the private sector, although it had survived the vicissitudes of the 2006 to 2008 period, they were in great trouble economically, and unfortunately, many of them are back there and battling, but they are all still operational.
That's amazing.
They all achieve very high standards. That they are all linked to the Cambridge examination board system, and many kids, perform superbly. In fact, as Minister of Education, I had an occasion to speak to the deans of South African universities, and they continued to speak then, and I don't think much has changed in the last 7 years or so, about the high quality of graduates from particularly our private secondary schools.
Right. Now, I'm going to be turning our attention now to the current situation in Zimbabwe. But before I do, I just want to mention that I picked this information up yesterday. The inflation rate in Zimbabwe is now being officially quoted at 837% in a report by Bloomberg. What do you say about that?
Well, this is what I say about Mugabe and Mnangagwa. Mugabe, over a long period of time, allowed policies to be developed that, in the course of a decade, resulted in hyperinflation, which peaked in 2008. It's only taken Mnangagwa 2 years to get back to that. And for the average Zimbabwean, they've seen their their pensions and their savings completely destroyed twice in the space of about 15 years. And the situation now is even worse than it was in 2007, 2008, because it comes on top of what happened then. And so, the words retirement and pension don't form part of the Zimbabwean vocabulary any longer.
Right.
People have to keep on working, and it doesn't affect people like me as much, Scott. I'm a lawyer. I'm senior partner of one of the oldest law firms. I have a good client base. We have a good client base. And although our income has dropped substantially in the last two years, we're not poverty stricken.
Right.
But there are millions of Zimbabweans who are now poverty stricken. The Food and Agricultural Organization in December last year released a report saying that over 7 million, I've got that figure right, 7 million Zimbabweans are food insecure. And that situation has got far worse this year. So you can imagine if you're a poor subsistence farmer or a vendor or someone who's unemployed and you're faced with hyperinflation and whatever savings you had are destroyed, there's very little food in the fields because of the chaos in the land sector. And so the consequences of this inflation for predominantly poor black Zimbabweans has been catastrophic.
Devastating. Now, it's interesting. I read that the World Food Programme, or WFP, says that 60% of Zimbabweans, or 8.6 million people, will be food insecure in 4 months' time, i.e. by December this year, which is an extraordinary figure of people. Now, here comes the polarity of Zimbabwe. Okay, you've got something like 7 million people today who are starving in Zimbabwe. And yet, at Victoria Falls, you've got a tourist resort called the Old Drift Lodge, which costs $1,500 per night. And apparently they've got quite a few people going through it, even now, during COVID-19. That's an extraordinary disparity between the rich and the poor. Where do those people come from that stay at a place like the Old Drift Lodge at Vic Falls?
Well, I've got a point I want to make, but let me deal with your question first. Most of the people who attend that would be foreigners. There'd be very few Zimbabweans who are able to afford something like that. And yes, that is a disparity. But of course, we have these disparities throughout the world where you have like Monaco and luxury Swiss skiing resorts that the vast majority can't afford. But the point I want to make in answer to you, Scott, is that the greatest disparity actually is not found between Victoria Falls, or a luxury lodge in Victoria Falls for foreign tourists, and your Zimbabwean who's starving. The greatest disparity is actually found in the northern suburbs of Harare, the capital, where we've got these astonishing mansions being built. I've just been told, I haven't had this verified, so I'm not going to name on your show the person, but the person named is a close confidant and supporter of Mr. Mnangagwa, the president. But this man, I've been told from a very reliable source, is in the process of building a huge mansion for himself in Harare. And he has contracted an engineering and construction firm, and the first quote given is for $50 million for this one house. When you drive around the northern suburbs of Harare, you will see mansions that you don't see in Johannesburg, you don't see in Sydney. It is quite astonishing. You've got some people who drive around in unique Rolls-Royce SUVs. There's a small number of them. We have there's a ZANU-PF MP and I've been an MP, so I know what an MP earns. And let me tell you, it's not a king's ransom. Who recently bought a Lamborghini. You've got Bentleys driving around Harare. You've got obscene displays of excessive wealth from people who don't. They're not the Bill Gates of this world. They haven't developed software that's been sold throughout the world. They have no obvious talent. They don't have any obvious large businesses in the country. This is corrupt money. And that's where the greatest disparity lies, between this tiny little elite. And it's a great irony, Scott, because in essence, what has happened in this country is one small minority, which was the white minority, which numbered 250,000, which obviously dominated the country and had disproportionate wealth, has been replaced by an even smaller minority. You're probably talking about 60 to 70,000, even possibly even less than that. It may even be just 10 to 20,000 people who are, I'll say it again, obscenely wealthy and living in this absolute sea of poverty, and are responsible for that poverty, because this country has been hemorrhaging for decades, and money which should have been spent on schools and clinics and roads and infrastructure has instead been spent on Mercedes-Benz vehicles and Bentleys and Lamborghinis and these massive mansions, foreign trips, and an extremely extravagant lifestyle. And so that is the disparity that any objective external observer should be focused on.
Right. Well, I find it interesting because I'm not going to say who this guy is, but apparently he's one of Zim's wealthiest men. And apparently he's worth about $3 billion US. And America has just frozen all his assets in the US because they said these are proceeds of crime. And I don't know if you followed that story, but I'm pretty sure he'd be one of those people with these big mansions in the northern parts of Harare. Okay, now let's get on to the human rights abuses. Now, one of the things that really disturbs me about what's happening in Zim is the arrest of journalists and politicians who don't fit in with the ZANU PF party. And, for example, the arrest of Hopewell Chinono. Can you tell us about that?
Hopewell Chinono is one of our celebrated journalists. He's received international awards. He worked for CNN, and he's an incredibly brave man. He has been working for himself he's a freelance journalist, and he has used social media to great effect in this country. And in the course of this year, particularly since the COVID pandemic broke out, he has almost single-handedly exposed massive corruption going to the very root of power. He exposed a scandal involving some $60 million US of funds that were meant to be earmarked for COVID prevention, and instead were siphoned off to companies with links, as I say, to the hierarchy.
Right.
This has been incredibly damaging to Mr. Mnangagwa. And in July, Hopewell Chinono was detained. Police raided his house. They smashed windows to get into his house. And since then, he has been detained. Now, he has been charged with a spurious, absolutely spurious offense. They've charged him with promoting violence to overthrow the government. Now, his Twitter feed was there for all to see. I'm on Twitter. I'm a regular, tweeter. And I followed him for years. One of my fundamental guiding principles is of promoting nonviolence. I went through one war. I have no desire to go through another war. And so I've always promoted nonviolence. And quite frankly, any Twitter feed that promotes violence, I simply block. I don't want to have anything to do with. And so the point is that I followed every single one of his tweets, and I've read the tweets that they've used to try and justify this prosecution, and nowhere do they promote violence. But be that as it may, he has now been in detention for 5 weeks. His legal team have repeatedly applied for bail, and on equally spurious grounds, bail has been denied. And today, I'm very deeply concerned for him because reports have come out from his legal team that he is now seriously ill in prison. We don't know what the illness is. It may just be flu, but he has a fever. He had night sweats last night, and one just hopes that it is not COVID. But the point is that this is an innocent man who is just doing his profession well, and he is now being persecuted for it. And we really need the world to speak out against this, to demand his release. The only way to describe him now is a prisoner of conscience. He is a political prisoner, and he should be released immediately.
Well, he's not the only person that this ZANU-PF government have done this to. There are a few journalists who've been put behind bars, and also the political opposition members who could be, trouble for the president. Tell us more about the deterioration of human rights in Zimbabwe under this tyrant.
It started even before he was inaugurated as president after the July 2018 election, which was seriously flawed. On the 1st of August 2018, soldiers were deployed into the streets of Harare, something that Mugabe had never done, and they gunned down protesters.
Yes, I saw that.
Central Harare.
Yeah.
That was followed in January 2019 with a further deployment of troops, and they too gunned people down and went a step further of actually raping women. At the time, many people were detained. Trade union leaders were detained, civic leaders, church leaders were detained. And since January 2019, we've seen a further steady deterioration. We've seen the specter of disappearances occur again. Since January 2019, some 70 people have been abducted by what the government has said is a third force, but which we've always believed have been state agents. And the usual modus operandi that has been employed against these people is that they get abducted, brutally tortured, and then dumped. And in the course of the last 18 months, teachers, a doctor, even lawyers have been arrested, detained, tortured. We've seen a deterioration in the judiciary, with the courts increasingly just doing the bidding of government. And in the last month or so, we've seen a further deterioration. I'm Treasurer General of the MDC Alliance, which is the leading opposition party in the country.
Right.
And we have lost two of our third-tier leadership in the last 3 weeks. Mazwi Ndlovu was murdered in Plumtree by a ZANU-PF operative some 3 weeks ago. And then just over a week ago, a man called Lavender Chiwara, who was one of our councillors, was murdered in a town west of Harare. So that is a very worrying deterioration. We have several of our senior leaders in detention at present. Honourable Job Sikala, a member of Parliament, is in detention as I speak. Other journalists and other activists are in hiding. They've been threatened. And at the end of July, we had a widespread crackdown to prevent a legitimate non-violent demonstration from taking place. So the situation is very concerning. And as I mentioned in my comments regarding Hopewell Chinono, we now have a regime which is prepared to detain journalists on spurious charges in the midst of the COVID pandemic, and quite frankly has put their lives at risk. Hopewell Chinono, I hope, will recover and get over this, but you can imagine being in a cell designed for perhaps 10 prisoners and with 40 or so people cheek by jowl.
Oh, wow.
Your chance of getting a disease like COVID are very high.
Absolutely shocking. Now, David, don't you personally fear some sort of retribution against yourself by this tyrant, because you are such a prominent member of the opposition?
Scott, I've been at this game for 37 years. My wife and I came back in 1983, having graduated, as I said earlier. I've been arrested. I've been charged with a spurious offense going right the way back to 1989. I've survived 4 assassination attempts. So yes, there is a threat. My son is now a human rights lawyer actually defending Hopewell Chinono. He's one of the legal defense team. He has been arrested twice in the last year or so. He's been badly assaulted himself. So I and my family face this threat all the time. And so we constantly have to be aware of that. Let me say this, though, that most tyrants are bullies, and most bullies are cowards.
Yes.
And ironically, interviews like this add a measure of protection. As long as I'm not, as I don't employ inflammatory language, and I never do, I've just been speaking the truth. And programs like this raise one's profile. It makes it that much harder for the regime to have a go at you. All 4 assassination attempts on me were not overt assassination attempts. Most of them sought to interfere, for example, with my vehicles to create traffic accidents. And so one has to take precautions. I have a very rigid security protocol that I follow and others in my position follow to try and counteract their machinations.
Right. It's absolutely shocking. I again just point at what's happening in South Africa. The same thing is happening in so many areas of South Africa, where within the ANC itself, the amount of assassinations that are happening because of one politician not wanting competition, so he takes out another ANC politician. It is quite extraordinary. It's the law of the jungle, which really brings me to the next question to you about Zimbabwe. this complete breakdown of the rule of law. You don't have law in Zimbabwe, do you? It's the law of the bush now.
Well, we have law, but we have rule by law, not rule of law. There's a fundamental difference between the two of those. Rule by law is employed by fascist governments. It's been employed down through the ages. You create unjust laws that target particular people, and then you use law as a weapon against your opponents. The rule of law says that you have rules that are designed for all people, and they apply to all people and are imposed on all people equally. And I believe very strongly in the rule of law. Of course, I do not believe in rule by law. Funnily enough, in this country, we have a very progressive constitution. Many of us worked extremely hard on that constitution for many years, and one of the achievements of the Government of National Unity between 2009 and 2013 was this new constitution, which was agreed to in a referendum held in March 2013. And although I have some criticisms of it, by and large, it's an excellent document, but it's an academic document. It's never been implemented, and it's only honored in its breach. The spirit and the letter of that constitution are really honored by this regime. So that is something that we have to get back to. We have to oppose the way our laws are being abused and applied selectively as they are. We have to oppose the laws that have been made in direct conflict with the constitutional principles. We have to oppose laws that have never been aligned by this government to the new constitution. We have laws in our statute books that ironically found their roots way back in the 1960s under Ian Smith. For all the criticisms of the RF, the fact is that ZANU-PF inherited these laws, in some ways refined them to suit their purposes better, and are still implementing these fundamentally unjust and unconstitutional laws. Let me make one other comment in this regard. There's a very important difference between where Zimbabwe is at today and, for example, where South Africa was at in the early 1990s. Because in the early 1990s, there was no consensus regarding what your constitutional order would be. Right. That had to be debated. And it resulted in you getting a new constitution. That's not the case in Zimbabwe. We've had a referendum. We had a massive turnout of voters. There was a huge national consensus. 95% of people who voted in that referendum, and there was a turnout, I think, of something like 60 to 70% voted in favor of that constitution. So ZANU-PF is in the minority. We have an overwhelming majority who believe in our current constitution, which has these fundamental human rights: the freedom of expression, the right for proper administrative conduct, the right for independent radio stations and television stations, the right that accused people have to have their lawyers and to be granted bail expeditiously. All of these rights are in the Constitution, and it is that Constitution which is being abused by this regime, and to that extent, the way forward for the country is to take us back to that Constitution and simply to implement it.
Right. I just want to quickly address those watching. Please, guys, remember to subscribe to be kept informed. This is the Loving Life channel. We have live streams every night at 8 p.m. Johannesburg time, and we always have very, very interesting subjects like the discussion we're having now with David Coltart, which I'm finding absolutely fascinating but disturbing. Now, David, one of the elephants in the room when you look at Zimbabwe's situation right now is the silence of South Africa. Even Julius Malema, who's a total radical political leader for the economic freedom fighters, has said, hey, South Africa, you got to do something about what's happening in Zimbabwe. And the ANC, I think, partly because they're fracturing internally and they're just sort of like a snake that's biting itself, they're not worried about what's happening around them. Have you found the silence of South Africa concerning when it comes to what's going on with their northern neighbor?
Unfortunately, Scott, it goes deeper than that. It's not been just silence. It's been the active support of South Africa, of Zimbabwe, and in fact, let me correct that, not of Zimbabwe. They haven't been in support of Zimbabwe. They've been in support of ZANU-PF over the last 2 decades. South Africa has been at the forefront of lobbying countries to support Mnangagwa. And I find it ironic because Zimbabwe's collapse, particularly its economic collapse, has exacerbated South Africa's problems. It's resulted in a massive exodus of refugees to Africa. President Mbeki at one point said that there were 3 million Zimbabweans in South Africa. It's exacerbated the problem of xenophobia in South Africa, where many black Africans feel that their jobs have been taken by black Zimbabweans. And so this has been a major problem. It was not a problem under Mandela, let me say that. I write about this in my book. I was privileged to meet Nelson Mandela in 2003, and Nelson Mandela, both privately and publicly, spoke out. He disagreed with what Mugabe was doing. But it was a problem with Mbeki, and it was a problem with Zuma. I think the jury is still out on President Ramaphosa, and we've been greatly encouraged in the last few weeks. Let me say this, for the first time since Mandela was president, we've had the ANC speak out against what ZANU-PF is doing. Lindiwe Zulu spoke recently and condemned what's happening in Zimbabwe. And we know from our private sources that the ANC is deeply concerned. In fact, the National Executive Committee of the ANC met today, and Zimbabwe was on the agenda. So we are hopeful that South Africa has learned from the mistakes it made in the past by either staying silent about grave human rights abuses, or in fact doing worse than that and supporting the regime, and that they will now start speaking out, not just for, let me say this, not just for the sake of Zimbabweans, but for the sake of South Africa as well. To come back to a point I made earlier on, Zimbabwe used to have the second strongest economy in Southern Africa, one of the strongest economies in Africa.
Yeah.
And all it now is a drain on South Africa. It has not provided the market for South African exports it could have. In turn, it has exported people, very poor people, to South Africa. So for purely self-interest purposes, it is time that the South African government it changed its policy and started holding Mr. Mnangagwa's toes to the fire to make him comply with the Zimbabwe constitution so that we restore legitimacy and democracy to this nation. And let me speak positively. As corrosive as Zimbabwe has been to South Africa and Botswana and the whole region, if we get Zimbabwe right and restore the Zimbabwean economy and stop the flow of people out of Zimbabwe, we will contribute greatly to the GDP, not just of Zimbabwe, but the whole of the sub-region.
Right.
And stability in Zimbabwe will bring stability to the whole region.
How do you do that?
How do we bring stability?
Yes.
Well, that's a tough question. It's not that easy. let me go back to a point I made just now. The solution to our problems is not to have a constitutional conference. We don't need the process that you went through in South Africa in the 1990s, because we already have a constitution. What we need, and by holding Mr. Mnangagwa's toes to the fire, what I mean by that is telling him that unless he complies with his own constitution, not the South African constitution, not any Western agenda, Zimbabwe's constitution needs to be complied with. And unless he does that, South Africa will not support him in the African Union. South Africa will not support him in the United Nations. And South Africa will develop a consensus with other democratic countries throughout the world to hold Mr. Mnangagwa to account. When South Africa starts to do that, I think that Mr. Mnangagwa is going to have to listen. He will have to start speaking to Nelson Chamisa, the leader, the only leader of the opposition of any significance. And then we need to agree on how we are going to conduct the next elections scheduled for 2023. They can't be held in the manner that they were held in 2018, in brazen violation of the Constitution and the law. And that is the way out for Zimbabwe. We need to level the electoral playing field. We need to get a neutral election commission. We need to ensure that every Zimbabwean who's eligible to vote, which means every Zimbabwean citizen over the 18 is entitled to be registered and to vote. And that will then be the process of taking Zimbabwe out of this very dire situation it finds itself in. But what is clear is that Mr. Mnangagwa has no intention of doing that.
That's right.
And we will achieve that if we have the support of the only country with real political muscle in the world, and that is South Africa. For all the economic muscle that countries like America and Britain and Germany have, they have no real interest in Zimbabwe. There's no strategic interest in Zimbabwe, and they're too far away from the crisis. Zimbabwe imploding doesn't affect their economies in any way. And so really South Africa is critical to this process. But if South Africa makes a resolution, and that means, in essence, if the ANC decide that they're going to act in the best interests of Zimbabweans and the best interests of South Africa, then I have no doubt that they can exert sufficient political muscle to get Mr. Mnangagwa to comply with the Constitution and get us through a free and fair election.
Right. Now, I think one of the defining differences, which you actually mentioned earlier, between Mugabe and Mnangagwa, is that I think Mugabe understood that his close supporters were not really expressing the view of the wider population, whereas I think Mnangagwa believes, because I think he has got an intellectual issue, believes that his close supporters represent what is going on in the rest of Zimbabwe. In other words, that everything is fine and dandy. What are your thoughts on that?
No, actually, if I got your question correctly, I disagree. I think that Mr. Mnangagwa knows that he has lost the support of the majority. I think that I'm no psychologist, but my interpretation, my understanding of Mr. Mnangagwa's approach is that it is rooted in fear. He is fearful of all that he has done. He was one of the principal people who executed Mugabe's orders against the people of Matabeleland, the destruction of Joshua Nkomo's ZAPU party in the 1980s. He has been the architect of the human rights abuses that we've seen in this country in the last 20 years. And he knows that if he loses power, he fears retribution, not so much from the international community, but from the Zimbabwean victims. secondly, there's no doubt that the hierarchy, this goes beyond Mr. Mnangagwa. This applies to that, say, 10,000 hierarchy that I mentioned earlier, of
Right.
obscenely wealthy political, military, and in some cases judicial leaders who have become obscenely wealthy on the back of people. And of course, they fear not just the loss of that source of income in future, but they fear that their corrupt acts will be exposed and that their wealth will be taken from them and that they will end up in prison for that. And that's what drives him. He's under no illusions, in my view, that he lacks the support of the vast majority of Zimbabweans. And that is why he is increasingly resorting to these draconian measures to keep himself in power, because he, as I say, he has lost the popular will of the people.
Right. Well, we'll discuss the way he's using the COVID lockdown to actually exacerbate that in a second. But I understand that the average man in the police and the army are also starving. It's only the elite that seem to be doing okay, thank you very much. And there is a huge and grave humanitarian situation with these 7 million people who are facing starvation. What is the answer to that? I mean, South Africa's going the same way right now.
Well, let me say at the outset that I don't think that the police and the army are starving. Mr. Mnangagwa knows, if I could mix my metaphors for a moment, which side his bread is buttered on.
Right.
And he has made sure that he has looked after the army and the police as well as possible. So, for example, soldiers have much better conditions than teachers in this country. So that's not where the starvation lies. The starvation lies in the rural areas in particular. It lies with the unemployed, poor urban dwellers. What is the solution to that? Well, the solution obviously is the revitalization of the economy, but in particular, the agriculture sector. Bear in mind that the agriculture sector in the past was responsible for the generation of the biggest single sector of the GDP of our country. And it also produced a mammoth amount of foreign exchange for this country in the past. Zimbabwe used to be the bread basket of Southern and Central Africa. We used to export food to countries all around us, including South Africa. And yet we have now become a net importer of food. We are now a basket case as opposed to a bread basket. And we have to change the agriculture sector if we are going to be able to not just boost the economy, but feed people. And it's one of the policies that we fundamentally disagree on with ZANU-PF. Let me say this as a member of the MDC, that we always understood that white land holdings in this country were unsustainable. It was politically unsustainable to have 11 million hectares of much of the country's best land controlled by 4,000 white farmers. That had to change. But our view was that it needed to be an evolutionary process, and there needed to be a process where there was an evolutionary, as I say, transformation of the agriculture sector. And that meant the training up of black commercial farmers who would take over farms that had been legitimately bought by the government or by the international community, and that there would be a close interaction. We wouldn't diminish the 4,000 white farmers. We would diminish the size of their land holdings, which could easily be done given modern technology and drip irrigation. One can produce much larger crops on smaller land than was possible 30 or 40 years ago. But you didn't have to get rid of the 4,000 farmers.
Right.
You just had to bring in a lot more, black farmers in the course of a couple of decades. Mugabe, ZANU-PF never did that. They got rid of our white farmers. They're now in Zambia and elsewhere in Africa. And we will probably never get them back. But moving forward, we have to address one critical issue, and that concerns title. What ZANU-PF did was not just get rid of white farmers, they got rid of commercial title to land, and they rendered a valuable asset into dead capital. As you know, financial systems throughout the world are dependent primarily on land holdings. Land historically holds the greatest long-term value of any asset in any country. And the land mortgage market is a critical market in any developed country. And so we have to restore title in this country. And it won't be title to white commercial farmers, it'll be title to black commercial farmers. Now, Mr. Mnangagwa and ZANU-PF have never been prepared to grant title, because when you don't have title, of course, you have no power. And you are more susceptible as a farmer to the threat of a government that you will lose your land if you don't toe the party line. And I've gone a long way around this topic, but the solution to hunger, in my view, actually ultimately resides in granting commercial farmers, black and white, title in this land. That will, once again, create value in land. We will be able to get the loans that we need to rehabilitate land, to get irrigation dams built, irrigation systems built. And then this country will not only be able to feed itself and feed poor, marginalized communities, the cost of food will come down, but we will also then be able to export food to the region and abroad again.
Right. Well, one of the biggest problems that the new evolving black farmer has had in South Africa is finance, because the banks won't give them any money to go and buy machinery and actually get started. So without that critical aspect involved in this transformation, what is happening in South Africa is that those once productive farms are now just lying fallow. There's nothing happening. And that's why the food crisis is getting worse in South Africa. And of course, with the farm murders and the farm attacks, a lot of farmers have been chased off their farms. So you've got a situation where the actual ability to create enough food to feed even the population in South Africa is becoming harder and harder. And you've got that exacerbating position where you've got the starvation in Zimbabwe, and the Zimbabweans coming into South Africa, which expands the population of South Africa. So you've reaching a critical point when it comes to the land issue.
I'm not a farmer, and I don't pretend to have any farming expertise, but a lot of this comes down to logic. And if I could briefly speak to the South African situation, and I have spoken to South African groups in this regard before. South Africans right across the racial divide desperately need to come to an accommodation, and there needs to be compromise on both sides. Let me come back to a discussion that we had earlier, Scott, about the need for an evolutionary change in a country. And that certainly applies to agriculture. There are two things that are going to make South Africa become food dependent. The one is if there's complete political turmoil and ongoing killings of white farmers, and even if they have their land, there's no one to farm them. That will be one extreme. The other extreme will be if government acts as the Zimbabwean government did and gets rid of all white commercial farmers and replaces them with black people. Either of those scenarios is going to be very damaging to South Africa. And there's need for compromise in the middle. There's some very good examples in Zimbabwe. I've got a very close friend and client who's used a portion of his commercial farm to develop an agricultural training college, and he has young men and women from neighboring poor farming areas come and be trained up, not just in agricultural expertise, but in business practice and the like. And they're then fed back into their communities so that they can manage their own small holdings more profitably. Now, this friend of mine is one of the largest chicken producers in the country. So he runs a very efficient, profitable business. And yet at the same time, he hasn't kept that wealth for himself. He has used it, as I say, to uplift people around him and to transfer skills. And I might be naive in this, but my view of South Africa is that it's not too late. If there is this accommodation, if white farmers realize that their current land holdings are unsustainable and that they have to yield in some way and have to develop this new generation of competent black farmers, and they work in collaboration, then not only can they remain on the land, but this political hot potato can be dealt with. And we can see the evolution in South Africa of a new generation of black commercial farmers who will then actually defend commercial farming, irrespective of the farmer's race. You know, we've seen that in this country in the legal profession. I know it's completely different. But after independence, for example, in my firm, which was an all-white firm, it's one of the oldest firms in Zimbabwe. It was started in 1897. But we brought on black partners, and we now have an overwhelming majority of black lawyers in our firm. And of course, there's a completely overwhelming majority of black lawyers in the legal profession in Zimbabwe. And they are the men and women who defend the highest standards of the legal profession, because they understand that the legal profession is best served by men and women of integrity. And we've seen that same attitude displayed, for example, going back to this friend of mine. He has been subjected to all sorts of threats by government, and he hasn't had to defend himself. He has been defended by poor black farmers, his poor black farming neighbors, who understand that he brings value and he is improving their lives. And let me stress, he's no raving liberal. He's a very conservative-minded person.
Right.
He's a man of great integrity, but he's realized that, you know, he's got to give back, and if he wants to survive, he's got to act in this practical fashion.
Get the community to support him.
Well, exactly. And my hope is, look, it's not going to happen in every community in South Africa.
Right.
But if white farming communities seek an accommodation, and it also depends, let me stress this, on sensible policies and sensible rhetoric from the ANC government
and other political parties.
And work this accommodation. It can still happen in South Africa.
Yeah. Now look, I just want to put on record that one of the big lies that has been put out there by the political parties is that 78% of land is owned by the white community. That is a complete and utter lie. A huge percentage of South Africa is owned by the ANC government themselves. Now, the other point I'd like to raise is that most of the white farmers live on farms which are very dry. You know, you have to have a lot of experience and skills into how to have cattle raised there, how to grow crops. It's not something someone who comes, you know, from a town can go and set up and become a farmer. It just ain't going to work. Whereas the really good farming lands are in KwaZulu-Natal, and the overwhelming majority of that land is either owned by the king of the Zulus, which he's got that huge trust in that land which has a lot of farms, and it's the rest is largely owned by the black community, and that's the most arable, fertile area in South Africa. So the two big lies are that the white population owns 78% of the land, which is bullshit. I think it's somewhere around 22% or something like that. And then that figure is exacerbated by these huge farms in the places like the Karoo, which are basically arid. It's like desert, and yet they're still able to raise a few goats and a few sheep. So they're not really farming land. So there's this big lie that's been put out there to the world that suggests that the whites are keeping all the land for themselves. It's actually the ANC government that are not releasing farmland to their own community, and when they do release it, they release it to their own ANC cadres. Now, I've had a bit of a rant about that. Let's move on to the impact
Can
of...
I just respond to that?
Yeah, please do. Yeah.
In my view, the problem in South Africa comes back to the same thorny issue of title. We have the former homelands in South Africa where there's very little title. As you say,
yes.
A lot of these lands are traditional lands. And one can't change custom and tradition overnight. I'm not naive about that. I understand that this has to be, I'll use the word again, an evolutionary process, a generational process. But until title is granted right across South Africa, land will remain dead capital. And there's also an environmental factor at play here, that where land is owned by no one is responsible for it. And so if you're going to protect land from erosion and general environmental degradation, experience throughout the world shows that you need two things. You need to grant title to the land, and you need to have rigid environmental policies which are enforced, back to the rule of law. And in my view, it's not going to happen overnight, but the vast sweep of the former Transkei and KwaZulu-Natal, my understanding, my limited understanding, albeit of South Africa, is that most of those lands are not titled. And the future of South Africa depends on, and we're not talking about white South Africans, on black South Africans being given title to land. And the same applies in other areas. Now, there are further things that need to be done. Government needs to invest a vast amount in agricultural training.
Yes.
So that a new generation of black farmers are developed, not to do subsistence farming, to do commercial agriculture.
Right.
And then one needs to tackle the financial community to ensure that these farmers are brought on and trained. And that, once again, is where white farmers have a role to play, so that you have a form of internship where potential black farmers can be hired as managers on white farms and develop the expertise and the wherewithal to then go and buy commercial farms themselves and be backed by financial institutions to do so. So we've got to move away from all the hot air and the political talk and get some sound economic and educational policies implemented.
Right. Now, in the side chat, Mara Faree has said, true, almost 68% of land in South Africa is owned by the government and 20% by the black population, and the rest is the white farmers that produce food for the whole of South Africa. Now, I'm not sure of those figures, but it sounds 68% sounds a bit high, but it's certainly that the fact is that the white community do not own 78% of the land in South Africa, which has been bandied around by the mainstream media. Now, let's move on to COVID-19. How has the lockdown over COVID-19 been used by this tyrant?
As we've seen throughout the world, tyrants have exploited COVID-19 to impose draconian measures. And Mnangagwa has been no different. We've had curfews imposed here. We've had thousands of people arrested, and we've had, for example, on the 31st of July, when people wanted to go into the streets to demonstrate against corruption, COVID was used as an excuse to further tighten up on the curfew, to deploy the police and the military throughout the country to clamp down on activists. And even when some of these activists like Hopewell Chinono were arrested and brought before court, COVID was used as an excuse, saying that they were irresponsible for calling for demonstrations, for what they said were violent demonstrations, when Hopewell Chinono did no such thing. And ironically, of course, they've now put him in prisons which are infested by COVID-19. And we fear for his life as a result. So they have used COVID-19 to great effect. The other thing that they've done, let me speak as a member of the MDC, and we haven't discussed this at all this evening, is they've used the cover of COVID-19 to decimate the political opposition. A few days after the lockdown was announced, the Supreme Court curiously released a judgment which they'd been sitting on for months on end, which made this gave this ruling that a tiny minority faction of the opposition should be able to, in effect, take over a majority of the party. And this judgment has subsequently been used to remove MDC Alliance members of Parliament from Parliament, to deny the MDC Alliance political finance, which we are entitled to in terms of the Political Finance Act, and in the last couple of months to actually take over our headquarter building in Harare, with the curfew being used to great effect with the assistance of the military. To put it in a South African context, this is Alice in Wonderland stuff. It's truth stranger than fiction. It's very hard to describe to people from outside of the country what's going on, but this is the equivalent of the ANC allowing the UDM to remove Democratic Alliance members of Parliament from the South African Parliament and replace them with their own, who have never been elected, and then diverting monies used, or rather owed to the Democratic Alliance, to the UDM, and then finally using the South African military to take over the Democratic Alliance headquarters and to hand it to the UDM. So Mnangagwa has done all of this under cover of COVID-19.
Wow. Well, in South Africa, they have just a handful of people who are now making the decisions under the lockdown, which is a similar situation. Of course, they're all ANC. Now, I just want to address people watching. Please, guys, remember to subscribe to this channel to be kept informed. I will be putting your questions to David very shortly. We just got a couple of other things to discuss first. Okay, so in South Africa and Zimbabwe, we've touched on this a lot. There's a huge amount of corruption and theft at all levels of government. Tell us about the level of corruption that's taking place in Zimbabwe under this Mnangagwa.
As I said earlier, we've seen far more brazen, much higher levels of corruption take place in this country than have happened under the 37 years of Mugabe's rule. It's been used under the cover of government policies. One of the policies that Mnangagwa has promoted is something called command agriculture, which is, in theory, designed to centralize procurement of farming inputs and agricultural machinery, and to allocate that to farmers who, in theory, are then going to be more productive and generate higher yields.
Right.
But this has resulted in the siphoning off of literally billions of US dollars
Wow.
to the hands of this tiny minority of elite corrupt leaders. So it makes Zuma's the corruption that Mr. Zuma and the Guptas were accused of pale into insignificance. And of course, this is in a country with an economy which is a fraction of the size of South Africa's economy.
Right.
That has continued recently. I mentioned earlier the diversion of some 60 million US dollars, not Rand, not Zimbabwe dollars, US dollars, of funds designed to combat the COVID-19 pandemic that ended up in a shelf company fronted by disreputable people, but it appears to implicate very senior people in government. And so we are ravaged by corruption, and it is reflected in the state of the economy. Bear in mind, let's take this back to economic indicators. Even in these times of economic turmoil, this is a country which is conservatively estimated to generate some $7 billion US dollars in exports a year. Those are mainly mineral exports. There are also tobacco exports, and of course we have tourism. I'm talking a pre-COVID situation.
Right.
And with that amount of foreign currency generation, this is a country that battles now to import drugs and basic medications. And one questions, where has that foreign currency gone to?
Yeah.
And as I say, you drive around the northern suburbs of Harare and you can see these extreme displays of wealth that are not backed by expertise, by companies functioning in the country. You can see where this money has gone to and how it has been spent. So corruption is now endemic in the country, and unfortunately it has trickled down because people are destitute and starving. Many Zimbabweans now who weren't, say, corrupt, say, 10 years ago, are now forced to be corrupt if they are to survive.
Right. Now, Mel F says, I'm going to start giving you some questions from the people who are watching. Mel F says, who wants to know, what is the name of David Coltart's book?
Okay, well, I'll put it out for you so that you can see it. I don't know if you can see that.
Yeah, to hold it a bit further back. The struggle continues. 50 years of tyranny in Zimbabwe. David Coltart. There you go, guys. And you can get that on Amazon, can you?
You can get it on Amazon, and it's available in South Africa. It was published by Chinono Media in South Africa. It's available at Exclusive Books and CNA. And if they don't have it, just Google Chinono Media. They have copies for sale in South Africa and also, as I say, on Amazon. And it's available in Kindle and in iBooks as well.
Fantastic. Okay, now Bruce Basters has asked, please ask David, was he a member of Parliament when the white farmers were murdered and chased off their farms? And whether it was or not, what did he do to stop it?
That's a good question. I was first elected to the opposition MDC in June 2000. And Hansard, and in my book, you can read the measures I took in Parliament to oppose legislation which was used to evict farmers. I have, as a private lawyer, represented hundreds of farmers in the last 3 decades, and I still represent commercial farmers. It's been a very difficult environment. It's been exceptionally frustrating over these decades, seeing many of my clients treated in an abominable fashion, evicted from their farms, never paid any compensation, and even some of my clients were murdered.
Now, Jan van Riebeck has asked, what made you not leave when things are getting hot for you?
It comes back to the first question that you asked me, Scott.
Family.
Fundamentally, my faith, our belief that the good Lord wants us in this country, the support of my wife, obviously, our family, and wonderful friends.
Right.
And also, let me speak about my black colleagues in the MDC. Many of them have been absolutely inspiring. I live in a low-density suburb. I have many security features in my house. I have a high international profile. Most of my black colleagues have none of these things, and yet they continue going. And quite frankly, one would be embarrassed to leave this country and to desert such brave colleagues like them.
Right. Rob Roy asks, David, as a former sports minister, I think you weren't sports minister, were you?
I was Minister of Education, Sport, Arts and Culture for my sins.
Okay, and he says you were instrumental in Zimbabwe's reintroduction into Test cricket. Who then are some of your favourite Zimbabwean cricketers of all time? Oh,
I like that we're lightening the conversation. It's been a pretty gloomy conversation so far. So the great question. And we'll probably spend the rest of the evening talking about this. But, well, going back in time, of course, the great Colin Bland inspired me.
Oh, he was amazing.
Frick Dupree, no, not Frick Dupree. Well, I'm showing my age now. But in more recent times, and bear in mind those names were people I knew as a child. The people who've inspired me since coming back to this country have been people like Trikos, Pycroft, but more recently, of course, Andy Flower and Heath Streak, both of whom are close personal friends of mine, and Henry Alonga. Let us never forget the black armband demonstration of Andy Flower and Henry Alonga in 2003, where they courageously stood against what was happening in our country. And not only were they amazing cricketers, I mean, Andy Flower was one of the best cricketers Southern Africa, not just Zimbabwe, has ever produced. In 2001, he was the #1 batsman in the world. He was, as you know, batsman, wicketkeeper. And Heath Streak as well, if you look at his stats, then more recently, there are people like Sean Williams and Brendan Taylor, outstanding cricketers. Tatenda Taibu. One of my frustrations, having lost office in 2013, is that we started to restore Zimbabwe cricket. We got Test status restored, and that started to reflect in improved performances on the field.
Right.
Sadly, cricket is going down as well, but we still have enormous passion for cricket in this country, and I'm pleased to tell you that some of these greats like Heath Streak and others have now got their own children, and there's a very talented new generation coming through. Sean Williams' father told me recently that our current under-14, under-15 team is one of the strongest age group teams that this country has ever produced. So there is hope for the future.
Right. Now, Viking Boer has asked, can David tell us how far are the Chinese involved with Zimbabwe? I've heard rumors that they've got army in Zimbabwe and they've got military machines in Zimbabwe. Have you heard those rumors?
I don't think that they have anything other than military attaches, but where they have got heavily involved in our military is in the defense college that was constructed in Harare. It's basically an army university. And they have a disproportionate influence through that institution, which they built and funded. But the Chinese interest in Zimbabwe is not so much ideological. It's more of a business interest in this country. They've been heavily involved in diamond mining and platinum mining, to the great detriment of this country. This wealth has not remained in Zimbabwe, and it has come at a huge cost to our environment. So unfortunately, the Chinese, on balance, have been a very negative factor in this country.
Right. And Stuart Campbell asks a similar question. He says, please ask David how the deal with Russia has affected Zimbabwe.
Putin has been a great supporter of Mnangagwa, as Putin is a supporter of the leadership in Belarus at present. He's a dictator, and so he feels he can do business with Mr. Mnangagwa. The Russians have been involved primarily in mining, in the platinum sector. The thinking is that they're not as bad as the Chinese, but we have this bottom line of theirs that they are there for short-term gain. They are involved in extractive industries, and very little of the wealth generated by our platinum remains in this country.
Right. Now, I'm going to relate a Nigerian proverb to you, David. And the proverb is, the stubborn fly that does not listen to advice follows the rotting corpse to the grave. Is this Mnangagwa's fate, do you think?
I've spoken about my faith before, and I come back to my faith rather than a Nigerian proverb. The scriptures tell us in Romans 1, which is one of my favorite chapters of the Bible, that people become so depraved, so distorted by their violation of God's fundamental commands and standards that they lose sight of what they're doing.
Right.
And they then become slaves to their own wrongdoing. And my belief is that the political hierarchy in this country have fallen into that trap, that they are so deeply engrossed in their corrupt acts and their violence that they are now blind to the consequences of that and the rising anger which is being generated in this country against them. And history shows, history is replete with examples of tyrants who dig themselves into a corner, dig a hole for themselves, and they keep making it worse. And ultimately it leads to their demise, and I think that that's where we're headed.
Right. Okay, now, post Mnangagwa, I always have a problem saying his name, I'm sorry.
It's quite easy. Start off with an M, Mnangagwa.
Mnangagwa. Oh, there you go, I got it, thank you. I always try and do it the English way. Now, I just want to ask you this one question in conclusion. And before I do, I just want to say that it's been a really interesting and informative discussion. Thank you so much. And I can tell you we've had a really good following tonight on this live stream. Okay, the final question is, okay, the solution is obviously compliance with the Zim Constitution. How do you get to that point?
We're going to go over some ground we have already covered. The critical thing is for the international community to build a consensus.
But they're missing in action.
yeah, exactly. South Africa is critical to this. South Africa can provide the political muscle, but it will need the economic muscle of the EU, Britain, and America to come alongside South Africa and to use a carrot and stick approach. We need Mnangagwa to be spoken to directly by South Africa to say that all support will be withdrawn for his regime by South Africa, and that South Africa will work within SADC and the AU against what he is doing unless he changes. We then, if Mnangagwa receives that threat, and bear in mind that he's cynical towards South Africa. He has his own experiences that violence has worked for four decades, and that he's never been held to account for that. He's acted with complete impunity. And so it's his default position. And as he gets further into this corner, so he will become more violent because it has been a very useful and effective method for him. And South Africa has to tell him that there will be consequences for him. That is step number one. Step number two is to come in and to make ZANU-PF as a political party and their rank and file membership realize that there can be life after a transition. I believe as a Democrat that for all my complaints of ZANU-PF, that actually we need ZANU-PF as a political party going forward. A political party, not the political party. We will always need a political opposition in this country. One of my beliefs as a Christian is that every single person given power, be that person Emmerson Mnangagwa or David Coltart, if we give an untrammeled power, unrestricted power, we abuse it. Lord Acton once said, power tends to corrupt. Absolute power corrupts absolutely. Yeah. And the same applies to all of us. But the point I'm making, it's the second step, is that ZANU-PF has to be persuaded that there can be life after a transition. And that's where I've got to put my human rights law to one side and to say that in the interests of saving lives and in the interests of taking this country forward, there is going to have to be some amnesty. It cannot be a total amnesty. It's got to be an amnesty based on a revelation of the truth of what has happened. It has to be an amnesty based on a genuine apology to the people, but an amnesty that has a vision of taking the country forward. And in that way, one hopes that you can take them out of their corner a bit, get them out of this combative mood that they are in. We then need to stabilize the country. There is no way that ZANU-PF has the integrity or the competence to see us through to the next election. But we have a constitutional problem in that we can't have another coup. And so we will have to reach an agreement whereby Mnangagwa brings in people, and I'm not talking about the MDC alliance. We need a transitional authority made up largely of technocrats and more neutral people. And in some respects, I'm being very naive in this. I'm talking about the ideal, but to stabilize the country, to bring our laws into conformity with the Constitution, particularly our electoral laws, to get a genuinely independent electoral commission in place, to reform our media, to get some independent radio and television stations. To digress, after 40 years after independence, we don't have a single independent radio or television station in this country, and we need that in the run-up to an election. And then, of course, we need to ensure that one person, one vote is complied with. It sounds ironic. It's what black nationalist parties fought for. They fought a war for this, and yet they deny the vote to hundreds of thousands of Zimbabweans.
Yeah.
They need to be brought in. And then we need to work towards the next election in 2023. Excuse me, I've spoken too much and I haven't had a glass of water with me. But we need that transition so that during 2021, 2022, leading up to July 2023, we can stabilize the economy, stabilize the electoral environment, get political prisoners out of prison, get a discussion going on so that the MDC Alliance and ZANU-PF and any other political party that wants to put its hat in the ring can appeal to the Zimbabwean electorate, say what their policies are, debate them openly, and then allow the Zimbabwean electorate to elect a new leadership which enjoys the popular will of the majority. That is the way to take the country forward. But as I said time and time again this evening, it needs South Africa and it needs the democratic world, not the Russias and China, because they don't know the first thing about a free and fair election.
Right.
It needs the democratic world to come alongside South Africa and Mr. Ramaphosa to provide him with the financial clout that South Africa doesn't have at present, and to combine that with his political muscle in South Africa, in SADC, as chairman of the African Union, to bring this political settlement about.
Well, I think that if that happened, you'd have a huge influx of roadies from around the world because they really miss and they love their country.
Well, let me end on this note, Scott. That's, as I said, one of the reasons I'm still here. I'm an avid mountain biker, and I've just spent this past weekend having a break in something called the Heritage Challenge, which is a ride across the Matopus south of Bulawayo, where Cecil John Rhodes is buried. And I was reminded again of the stunning beauty of this country and its potential. This is a country which still has the potential to be the strongest economy, the strongest nation in Africa, wealthier per capita than even South Africa. But of course, we need the expertise, not foreigners, Zimbabweans who spread it across the world, many of whom are probably listening to your show this evening. Now, old people like myself are probably not going to come back because, it's too tough for them to uproot themselves.
Yeah.
But the generation of my children need to come back, black and white. We've got hundreds of thousands of Zimbabweans right across the world with great expertise, great experience, who can come and rebuild this country and make it great again.
Well, under a new Zimbabwe, there would be great opportunity as well. David, I just want to say thank you so much for joining us tonight. It's been an absolute pleasure. I can tell you now the people who've been watching you talk about Zimbabwe have really found it enlightening, and it's given great insight into what's happening on the ground in Zimbabwe. So thank you so much.
Well, thank you for focusing on Zimbabwe. We need as much focus, and to those listening, please don't give up on Zimbabwe. Please educate yourself and do whatever you can to lobby governments and newspapers and others wherever you are, so that we can bring change to this great country.
Fantastic.
Good night.
And I just want to say to the moderators, thanks guys for keeping an eye on the side chat, and for those who've participated and sent questions through, thank you for that. And for people who watch this video later, I hope you find it as informative and as enjoyable as I have. And with that, I'm going to say good night to everybody, take care, and we'll catch up tomorrow night. We've got another live stream happening then.